In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Please be seated. In today's gospel from Matthew, Jesus begins by comparing his generation to children who neither want to play happy games or play sad games. Jesus points out that John the Baptist was calling for repentance, a kind of sad game, but because of John's ascetic and harsh lifestyle, the people couldn't see his sacredness. They even went so far as to say he had a demon. Then, on the other side of the spectrum comes Jesus, who focuses on love and joy, like the happy games. But people were missing his sacredness as well, because he was a friend of sinners and tax collectors. They labeled him as a glutton and a drunk. They were blind to the sacredness that was right in front of them. Sometimes when we have things that happen that don't look like what we think they should, or don't behave like we expect, we are blind to those things. Sometimes I think our Christianity is blind to the Jesus it is supposed to represent. Jesus is a person of color. Jesus is Middle Eastern. Jesus was a refugee. Jesus is a black and brown person whose life didn't seem to matter to those in power. But we have been blind to that Jesus because all around us we see lots of images and statues of a white Jesus, a Jesus of privilege, a Jesus of power. Now I know how these images began. They began because we long to see a Jesus like us. Throughout Christianity, cultures often depicted a Jesus who was incarnated and became one of our own. So you have a Greek Jesus, or an African Jesus, or a Russian Jesus, or an Asian Jesus, and now we have a white Jesus. The problem occurred when the church spread with colonization and spread with slavery. And rather than presenting the new Christians with a Jesus who looked like what they saw in the mirror, the slaves and the colonized were presented with a Jesus who looked like the slave owner and the colonizer. This image is directly opposed to a local Jesus who was born into oppressed community. It has made many of us blind to the Jesus all around us. Jesus is often misunderstood by the people in our time, and Jesus was misunderstood by the people in the gospel time as well. They judged Jesus by who he hung out with. How many times have we been judged by who we hang out with, or only one aspect of who we are, one of our identities? So imagine that each of us is a beautiful flower. So you're a flower, and you're a flower, and you're a flower, and you're a flower. Now imagine that each one of the petals on your flower is one of your identities. And when I say identity, I'm talking about one aspect of who someone is. Think of things like gender, or race, or religion, socioeconomic status, age, job, political affiliation, sexual orientation, or whether or not someone is in recovery. We can't judge the flower by only one petal. If you say someone is black, or someone is Muslim, or someone is gay, that doesn't describe them as a whole person. How many of us have been judged by only one of our petals? I know I have. We need to see the people as the whole flower and not just one petal. And likewise, when we say things like, you don't act gay, or I don't think of you as a Muslim, or I don't see color, we are denying the full humanity of someone. It's like we just grab their flower and rip those petals right off. Hopefully, we can come to a place where we see the beauty in this humanity bouquet, where we and every petal is still there, where we see the flower in its entirety, and where every flower belongs. Jesus said, "Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Well, a yoke is the thing that oxen or other animals wear to work the plow. In the churchy writings of the time, yoke refers to the task of following the law. And laws could get quite complicated. And the Pharisees were very fond of the laws and very focused on the laws, and they interpreted and twisted those laws in ways that Jesus didn't always agree with. Much the way laws today are twisted to benefit those in power, those with money, or those with privilege. Following the laws, or wearing the yoke as it were, was easy if you had means or money or power. But for those without it, that yoke didn't fit, and following the laws was next to impossible. That is why Jesus is saying his law is easy and his burden is light. Jesus doesn't have a complicated or complex law. It's very simple. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And you can even break it down simpler than that. Love God and love neighbor. Our society is weary and has been carrying some heavy burdens. The burdens of two pandemics. We have the pandemic of COVID-19 ravaging through our communities, disproportionately killing our relatives, friends, and neighbors, uprooting our sense of safety, normalcy, and keeping us in a constant state of ambiguity and anxiety about the future. Loving God, loving our neighbor during the COVID pandemic means making sacrifices so that we can save lives. It means wearing a mask when you're out in public and around others. It means having streaming worship services that sometimes have technical glitches rather than being in the pews. It means not coming to work or church or other social engagements if you are feeling sick. It means having to inconvenience ourselves so that our relatives can be safe. We do that because we value the lives of others and because we love our neighbor. But we also have another pandemic, the pandemic of racism and white supremacy that has been a part of our country since its founding. Yesterday, many of us celebrated our independence. Are you aware that in the Declaration of Independence, indigenous people are listed as merciless Indian savages and are one of the reasons that the Founding Fathers give as to why they're declaring their independence? Racism is such a part of the fabric of our country that often, when we speak out against it, people think we are speaking out against the country itself. And some people think that racism is a political issue. And when Christians think that dismantling racism is a partisan political issue instead of a moral one, the church and Christians have failed in their duty to respect the dignity of every human being. Loving God during the pandemic of racism means loving God's creation. As human beings, we are all made in God's image. Being made in God's image is a beautiful thing, and it tells us some things about God. It means that God is male and female and non-binary, fat and skinny, black and white and brown and every shade in between. God is old and God is young, and God is tall and God is short, and God is able and God is disabled. God is all of that. And to prove that point even more, his only son Jesus to become one of us. Loving God means loving her creation. Remember, you will never look into the eyes of someone that God does not love. So what does loving our neighbor look like in the time of pandemic of racism, or any oppression for that matter? It means we must learn about racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, and all the other ways that we oppress one another. It means learning about and acknowledging the privileges we receive that we did not earn. It means learning how those privileges translate into someone else's disadvantages. For example, as someone who is biologically male, for every dollar I earn, an equally qualified female earns 85 cents. My 15% advantage is someone else's 15% disadvantage. Loving our neighbor means asking ourselves, what is our responsibility in that situation? What is our responsibility with that privilege as a Christian, as a neighbor, and as a human being in this society? And Lord, we have some burdens to bear, but thankfully, your law, your yoke, love God and love neighbor. There are all sorts of other laws or yokes, written and unwritten, that exist in our culture. Don't take up those yokes. They are ill-fitting and their burdens are heavy. In 4th grade, I took on a yoke. It was a yoke that said, you better tease somebody else or you will get teased. It caused a lot of pain, and I caused a lot of pain because of that yoke, and that burden is heavy. At an old job, there was a yoke that said if I wanted to be friends with certain coworkers, I needed to gossip about people. And luckily for me, I learned from the burdens of the past and didn't take that yoke up. Don't take on those yokes of sorrow. Don't take on the yoke that says younger people are incapable of taking on leadership roles. Well, how are they supposed to learn if we always block them from leadership? Oh, and there is a whole another set about what it means to be a real man or a real woman. The yoke that says a woman's place is in the home, or she only has value if she has children. That yoke that says it's not okay for a man to cry or show emotion. Or the one that says men have to talk about women and treat them as objects. That yoke has burdens that are far too great for any of us to bear. So many of us have taken on those yokes, and today Jesus tells us to take those off. Jesus doesn't just ask us to take them off, but he commands us to take them off and put on his easy-fitting yoke. And with those yokes of sorrow, we need to take off the burdens that go with them. Lay down those burdens. Lay them at the foot of Jesus. That burden of toxic masculinity, lay that down, my brother. That burden of thinking you always have to be right, lay that down. The burden of thinking that there is only one right way to do something, give that to Jesus, because only Jesus is perfect. That burden of the good old boy club, lay that burden down. That burden of thinking success equals money, that burden of having to compete with your neighbors for the best car or the biggest house or the largest TV, lay it down. And most importantly, I want you to lay down. I want you to give up. I want you to let go of that burden of internalized oppression. Let go of the lies and poison society tries to feed those of us it oppresses. Let go of the shame. Let go of that burden that says you are not beautiful. Let go of that burden that says you are not good enough. Throw away that burden that says you are not worthy. Because you are called. You are commanded even to come to Jesus and lay those burdens down. Because Jesus' yoke, Jesus' law doesn't have those burdens. This yoke is full of grace. This yoke says you are loved. This yoke says you are loved, and this yoke says you are enough. Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Come and join this Jesus who liberates, this Jesus who loves, and this Jesus who lives.